people. I don't know if you've noticed over the last couple of years, there's been an upsurge in people trying to find out who their ancestors are. They're looking into their family tree, looking back over the years to discover the people who were part of their lives. The BBC has been running a couple of programs where it's called Who Do You Think You Are? And you get celebrities who start looking back at their past to see if they can find anybody of notoriety, any royals, any celebrity connection they may have going back centuries. For my part, I have a family member many times removed who worked for the Marquis of Bath on Longleat House. He was a blacksmith responsible for the gates and the surrounding walls. And other people in my past include police officers, solicitors, one or two people who spent some time in prison. And yet all of them have brought me to this point where I am today in my life. I think about other people, and particularly growing up in the valleys of South Wales, where on occasions your surname brought a certain notoriety. So there was Evans the bread and Williams the coal and Griffiths the milk. And you'd pitch up at school and a school teacher would say, oh, you're such and such's brother or sister. Oh, I remember I taught your father. And all of a sudden, the connections between your ancestors come up to present day. Have a think for a minute of the people who share your life, the people who are there for you right now, and then consider the connections you've had in the past. There's an Old Testament character called Moses, and Moses is the leader of God's people. But long before God called him, Moses murdered somebody and then ran away. And some 40 years later, God meets up with Moses in the desert at a burning bush. And he calls out to Moses from within the bush and asks Moses to do him a job. And initially, Moses is very reluctant and comes up with dozens of excuses, until eventually he goes back and says to the people that he is the one who's going to lead them forward. And he has this ongoing battle with Pharaoh, who is the king in Egypt, and Moses and the people of Moses are enslaved. And God reminds Moses that he is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. He invites Moses to look back well into his history to discover that God has been there from the very beginning. And in some respects, it doesn't matter what Moses has done or what he's achieved thus far in his life. God wants to use him now. And eventually, as the people leave slavery in Egypt to freedom and a new land, over all that time, God is trying to build a relationship with his people, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. And it's the sons of Jacob who form the 12 tribes of Israel and eventually become the 12 areas across the land. And you watch as the people of God, through their many ups and downs, twists and turns, many, many mistakes, establish themselves as God's people. There are others, of course, throughout the biblical history who, in spite of their notoriety, become people used by God. Moses, as I said, was once a murderer. David, Israel's greatest king, committed adultery with Bathsheba. And there are these periods in people's lives where they do the wrong thing or take the wrong turn, but God still invites them to be his people. When I look back upon my own life and see the many mistakes that I've made, I come to the realization that I've been shaped and molded by circumstance and the people who shared my life then and now, but I'm just seeking to follow God. One further example is that of Peter, one of the New Testament disciples. He is somebody who travels with Jesus on his journey, and yet at one point in his life he denies even knowing Jesus. And much later on in his story, he writes a letter to the churches that are around the area that he has founded, that are part of the people of God then, and he writes to them these words: "You are called to be God's special possession. You are a people who walked in darkness, but now walk in the light. You were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you did not receive mercy, but now you have received God's mercy." All the way along the line, no matter what has happened to us in the past, we are the people today shaped by experience, shaped by those who've gone before, but surprisingly, and perhaps with great wonder, God wants us to be his people. A people transformed by his grace, by his mercy, and by his love. I'm delighted to be part of the people of God.